In our previous video, we explored John Brzenk's journey from his early days to his big win at the 1986 Over-the-Top Championship. In this video, we delve into arguably the most pivotal years in his career, a period where John consistently entered the biggest tournaments globally and faced formidable opponents, refining his technique and solidifying his reputation in the arm wrestling world. This is part 2 of a multi-part series on John Brzenk, and if you want to follow along with the entire thing, make sure to subscribe to the Arm Historian. While Brzenk stayed relevant amongst the arm wrestling elite throughout every part of his career, this video covers the era where John Brzenk, the arm wrestling legend, would start to outgrow John Brzenk, the man.
On these. Anyway, we're going to talk about arm wrestling.
After John Brzenk won the Truckers class of the Over-the-Top tournament in 1986, the biggest and toughest arm wrestling competition the world had ever seen, he seemingly wanted to ride that wave into the sunset. The greater cultural impact of the Over-the-Top movie, in which John even briefly appeared on the competitive arm wrestling scene, was looking to be profound. With John's biggest competition, Scott Norton, a man with a record of 3-0 against Brzenk, retiring from the sport, John would keep doing what had become by this time almost routine. He looked for the biggest and most profitable tournaments that followed in the aftermath of Over-the-Top and continued to accrue wins in nearly all of them. By the end of 1986, he would compete in one of the premier leagues at the time and win another AWI world title. Arm Wrestling International, or AWI, had been around since the 70s and attracted some of the top talent in North America. However, one weird rules quirk set this league apart from others. The founder of the league didn't want to use the strap, so initially, athletes were forced to start in a deep hook after every slip. From the late 80s onwards though, the slip rule was done away with altogether, instead opting for the even more outrageous rule to have every single match start in a hook. Despite this eccentric rule, John won an AWI world title every year in the late 80s.
Double elimination type of tournament. John Brzenk Jr., Gary Goodrich, a lot of people predicted that.
The young American arm wrestler had developed a strong top roll by this time, but didn't shy away from any position on the table. John wasn't afraid to try new things, and had learned numerous moves from his interactions with a large variety of experienced pullers, having attended more tournaments by this time than many of his much older peers. John's versatility and consistency meant that he was especially suited to do well in an environment where rule sets would often change from one tournament to the next.
Real serious when you get at this caliber. I'm an arm wrestler myself, and if I make it to a tournament, especially where there's money, then I'm going to be serious.
Sounds like a lot of excitement ahead of us. We'll be back with the start of the 1987 Can-Am World Senior Championships right after this.
The Canadian American, or Can-Am, Championship is another such tournament, and had also been around since the 1970s, and went through several iterations over the years. John was keen to enter the Can-Am Championships as many times as he could during the late 80s, in part because some of the events offered a payout for the left arm as well, a rarity in those times, making the tournament especially financially attractive to John. Brzenk's left wasn't quite as formidable as his right, but was still at a very high level. He would end up winning multiple right arm classes in almost every edition of the tournament that was convenient for him to attend, and even a rare left arm win as well, in '86. Unfortunately, the Can-Am Championships fizzled out after its 1990 edition, an event John as well as a lot of other top pullers did not attend, because of a lack of prize payout for the winners. The Sands International Championships, sometimes known as the Sands Can-Am, was another tournament of the same ilk, organized by one of the same people behind the Can-Am tournaments. Although very little footage is available publicly of either of these tournaments, especially including John, he did consistently well at both the Can-Am and Sands events, accruing another 15 titles across multiple weight classes before the decade was even over. John also would go on to participate in the Petaluma Worlds yet again, this time in 1988, and won the middleweight class, as well as the heavyweight class that year, conquering the giant Richard Lupkes while doing so. At the following edition in '89, John would repeat this feat and once again dominated the stacked tournament. During this time, an early mentor of John, Dave Patton, who featured in part 1 of this series, was also still taking names at all the big tournaments of the day, albeit usually in a lighter weight class than John. It's clear that by the end of the decade, John was the current man to beat in his weight class, especially from the ones that regularly competed. He wasn't completely without competition though in North America, albeit usually from heavier weight classes. Richard Lupkes, even then already a long-time veteran of the sport, was lured back to competitive arm wrestling by the over-the-top tournament and was quickly becoming extremely dominant amongst the very top of competitive arm wrestlers, once again. Lupkes was arguably at his peak strength right before the end of the decade and proved his dominance over John Brzenk while wearing zebra-striped pants at the 1989 Paris Open. Even though Lupkes would eventually take another long leave from the sport several years later, John would go on to often quote Richard as being one of, if not the strongest puller he's felt on the table. In that same year, at the other side of the globe now, a sports medicine representative for Team USA found himself at a cultural exchange powerlifting event organized in the USSR.
People see me running barefoot, and the first thing they have to ask me is that, hey, aren't you worried about stepping on something?
Dr. James Stockson was part of an American organization that oversaw arm wrestling and weightlifting competitions and suggested to one of the people responsible for organizing these cultural exchanges that they should try arm wrestling. After a little back and forth, an event was set up, and not soon after, a group of North American arm wrestlers introduced the sport to the USSR through competitions in Moscow's Gorky Park. A cultural exchange program was set up to take place between the two nations that would eventually lead to a massive explosion of popularity for arm wrestling within USSR nations and all over the East. This seemingly insignificant decision by Dr. James Stockson, a figure that has now been all but forgotten, has had major rippling consequences on our sport worldwide. By the time the 1990s had officially started, arm wrestling had achieved quite a status in a lot of Eastern nations. One tournament from the early days of the organized sport in that region of the world was the Moscow Gold Bear International Tournament. Its first edition in 1990 was quite big in scale, with arm wrestlers from multiple nations being invited to compete, all expenses paid. John won the 90 as well as the 90+ kilogram category in what must have been a rather easy fashion, judging by his dominant performance against Zaur Skadadze in the Open Finals. John would later talk about his very first event outside of North America, looking back on it fondly, and mentions he felt very welcomed by the still young Russian arm wrestling scene. But he also made it clear that it was mainly a learning experience for them. In fact, John would go on to liken the experience to arriving in the local bar and arm wrestling strong guys that knew nothing about the sport. Despite arm wrestling growing rapidly in other parts of the world, the North American arm wrestling tournament scene was still the most substantial and financially lucrative, and as a consequence, the most attractive to John, although by now the hype around the sport seemed to be burning out slowly. John took a flight back to his home base in the US, and before 2 months had passed, entered the 1990 edition of the Petaluma Wrist Wrestling Worlds, where he, just like in the Golden Bear tournament, took first place in 2 classes. One relatively new organization was ramping up in scale and competition after 2 successful editions the years before. Yukon Jack, a Canadian liqueur made from Canadian whiskey and honey, was looking to expand its North American market and had seen success in similar brands sponsoring sporting events. After contacting Ray Darling, an arm wrestling tournament organizer, a deal was made to create arm wrestling events that would promote Yukon Jack as well as the sport itself. The tournament would also donate a portion of its profits to charity. John entered the 1990 edition of the tournament and quickly took first place in the heavyweights over the likes of Richard Lupkes. John would then seemingly continue to go full tilt on the local North American arm wrestling scene from here on out, accruing multiple state, AAA national, and AWI world titles during the 1990s. In 1991, John received an invite to what is perhaps one of the most interesting and eccentric tournaments of its day, in the French Super Bras de Fer. This televised spectacle, organized in Paris, sought to replicate the success of the over-the-top tournament, but seemed to have mainly invested in the Hollywood part, and not so much in the actual good arm wrestling tournament part. John ended up taking second place at Super Bras de Fer, after losing to a strong Gary Goodrich. The event was not a success, and John would later say he was very skeptical going into this event, and that the tournament didn't return on most of its promises. He also said that it was more of a staged show than a good quality arm wrestling event. Gary Goodrich was another athlete John often couldn't quite overcome on the table. Goodrich had been doing really well in some high-level tournaments for quite a few years already, and notably outweighed John by quite a bit. After his disappointing trip across the pond, John would get a chance to avenge his loss by winning the '91 edition of the Yukon Jack in Tampa, Florida. Notably, Ron Bath, another now considered legendary puller, came in second in this tournament.
John Brzenk toured the country. He found the more opponents, the merrier.
Perhaps spurred on by the international success his brother was achieving, Bill Brzenk had decided to start taking arm wrestling seriously in his early 20s, and subsequently entered in the 1992 Yukon Jack middleweight division. John won the heavyweight division over Gary Goodrich that year, and surprisingly, Bill took second in the middleweights after only Cobra Rhodes. It seemed the arm wrestling world now had two Brzenks to compete with at the highest level, yet again. John would go on to take the win in the '93 division in what was an extremely impressive field, not only ending up above Ron Bath and Gary Goodrich, but also over the giant farm boy Cleve Dean, who was tearing up the heavyweight scene to pieces once again. It seemed John's rather unique approach to training for the sport was starting to pay off dividends, with him at this point arguably being the #1 overall arm wrestler in the world. One thing that set John apart from many of his fellow competitors was dedication to actual arm wrestling practice as the main part of his training schedule. Spending time at the gym developing his muscles by lifting weights seemed mostly a waste of time to Brzenk. In fact, throughout his career, John consistently trained with a small group of dedicated pullers, but always made sure to go hard on the table. Of course, John never claimed that he didn't lift any weights. In fact, he most surely did. However, his main contention was that lifting weights had very little actual carryover to the arm wrestling table.
With John, it's always arm wrestling. He seems to think that's more beneficial to him than weightlifting, spa, whatever. But lately, we've got him into a body training, bodybuilding, because you've got to be in condition to do something like arm wrestling.
By the next year, at the 1994 edition of the Yukon Jack World Championships, John ended up coming in third after losing to Gary Goodrich, and with Cleve Dean ultimately winning the class. It's clear John didn't quite stand alone at the top, but was still a serious contender for the overall #1, and had solidified his position as undisputed in his own weight class, at least on the right arm. While John might not have been a household name to the wider public by the mid-90s, within the arm wrestling world, he was already a legendary figure. Even though the popularity of the sport seemed to grow at a very erratic pace, leading to rising uncertainty about its very future, one thing remained consistent. John Brzenk had become synonymous with arm wrestling and was not only the man to beat in his weight class, but had now truly become an almost legendary figure to those that practice the sport at any level. In the next video of this multi-part series, we'll see how John exceeded what everyone thought must have been his peak, and how even at that level, challengers would soon emerge to try and derail his consistent performance at the top of arm wrestling.